Welcome to Tomversations, a monthly conversation with me, your host, Tom Hollingsworth, on a variety of technical topics. Welcome back to Season 3. We've been doing this now for a couple of years, and we've had some very interesting conversations around some fun enterprise IT topics. And I wanted to kick off this season with a discussion around security. Now, anyone who was paying attention during the latter half of 2021 knows that security incidents were on the rise, specifically ones related to malware. Now, call it what you will, malware, ransomware, what have you. Malware is more of a general category. Ransomware specifically was the one that seemed to be getting the most press attention. These were tools that were being used by bad actors to encrypt files, to shut down portions of a network, to exfiltrate data. But they all have one thing in common. They all want you to pay money to get rid of them. And so what would happen was you would see a ransom demand, usually in Bitcoin or something like that. Ask the people who run the Colonial Pipeline or Kaseya or the JBS meatpacking facility how they feel about ransomware. I'd like to talk a little bit about that today, but also to talk about one of the solutions that came out of the ransomware epidemic, which was using disaster recovery tools as a way to recover from a ransomware attack. So let's start that conversation. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, disaster recovery, you mean like backups, right? Well, yeah, disaster recovery is the new terminology that we use for what we would used to consider backup and recovery software. Basically, taking your data and putting it somewhere safe and hoping that you never need it, but in the event that you do, you can put it back where it's supposed to be. Now, typically, when I think of disaster recovery, I think of two things. I think of what happens if somebody deletes a whole bunch of files they're not supposed to. It's a man-made disaster. And what happens if something else deletes those files, like an earthquake or a fire or a tornado? That's a bit more like an act of God type disaster or something that is a natural disaster. Well, we have this weird combination in the middle of a ransomware attack because it absolutely is a man-made disaster, just not one that you made. This is when, a tool gets in and say, let's encrypt all of the files in your network, all of the customer data, and in order to unlock it, you're going to have to pay a Bitcoin or a fraction of a Bitcoin. The key there is that these ransoms are generally expensive when you look at the conversion rate for the cryptocurrency that they're using for the payoff, but they're not so expensive that it's actually cheaper for you to try to fight the bad actor or try to recover on your own. There are tools that can go out and try to do this, but again, they are reassuringly expensive. So what happened? Well, a lot of companies that were historically focused on this disaster recovery business would go in and say, well, you know what? Rather than trying to unlock those files or rather than paying, why don't you just revert back to the data that you know is good, that we stored for you? Whether it was on some form of archival media like tape or some archive of storage somewhere in the cloud, or it was something more like a snapshotting function that allowed you to roll back to a certain point when you knew you weren't infected. And it was so successful for these companies that they actually pivoted and started selling themselves more as data protection instead of disaster recovery. You can see kind of how that flows, right? Protection. Where have I heard that term before? Oh, that's right, security. All right, so let me kind of give you an outline of why I think that data protection is actually a security function and not an infrastructure function. And that actually starts with the infrastructure. So I want you to imagine what a traditional enterprise IT infrastructure looks like. It's made up of a lot of different things, right? We can break those down into very broad categories. There's a network, there's servers, there's storage, and there's security, right? What is the purpose of a network? Well, at its most basic, it's designed to get data from one location to another, right? Its primary goal is to make something happen. Data flows from one server to another. What is a server's primary function? Well, at its most basic, it's to do computation on data. It's designed to make something happen. Storage stores the data that's been computed and stores it before it's transported. It's designed to make something happen. What is security's job? Is it to make something happen? Or is it to make something not happen? I would argue that its most simplistic, security's job is to make things not happen. It's designed to make sure that people who are not supposed to be reading your data don't read it. It's designed to make sure that people who are not supposed to be in your network aren't. And it's designed to secure people from seeing things they're not supposed to. I mean, that's what SSL essentially is, TLS. So security's function is effectively to prevent something from happening. Well, that's kind of what data protection's job is, right? We always say we hope we never need our backups, but you better have them just in case. And that's what data protection's job is. It's designed to prevent data loss. So ask yourself this question. In a perfect world, if everything worked the way that it was supposed to and people did what they were supposed to, would you need a network? Yes. You still need to move data back and forth. In a perfect world, if everything worked the way that it was supposed to and people did what they were supposed to, would you need servers and storage? Well, yes. I would need to keep the data somewhere and do computation on it. But in that same perfect world, if everybody did what they were supposed to, would I need security? Would I need to keep people out if they didn't go looking in places they shouldn't be? One could argue that you didn't. In a perfect world, if nothing ever got lost or broken or destroyed, or we never got hit with natural disasters, would I need a backup? I would argue that you don't. So can you see how these two things are kind of being categorized? And yes, I know that it's overly broad. So before you go down into the comments and tell me that I'm painting this with too big of a brush, remember that I'm trying to do this for a point. There's a category of infrastructure who's designed to do things. And there's a category of infrastructure that is designed to not let things happen. And ironically enough, all of the things that are in that category of not allowing things to happen all seem to be related to security. So why do I draw this distinction? Well, remember when I said that disaster recovery is security? I also think that it's the job of the security team to monitor the disaster recovery solutions. Now, here's where the pitchforks and the torches come out in the comments, because historically, disaster recovery, data protection, business continuity, call it what you will, has been the purview of the virtualization, server, storage, admin, grand unified theory. Why? Well, it deals with data. We've got to keep the data safe. So we're the ones who are going to monitor it. We're going to make sure that the backup jobs go off without a hitch. We're going to make sure that everything works the way that it's supposed to. Okay, I get that. But let me ask you a question. And it's related to something that we talked about all the way back in episode 7 in 2020. Risk. Security is a risk-averse organization. The job of security is to reduce the amount of risk that your infrastructure faces. Let's examine something simple like a routing protocol. Why do we make choices about the routing protocols that we use? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. We're looking for performance. We're looking for vendor agnostic versus vendor supported. We're looking for new versus old. I mean, effectively, when you look at it, the differences between choosing RIP, EIGRP, and OSPF all boil down to some form of performance or interoperability or something like that, right? What about a security solution? What are the reasons of why we make a choice to implement a security function? Well, they're almost always somewhere around the idea of the risk that we're trying to mitigate. Why do I use an identity management solution? Well, because I want to keep people from seeing things they're not supposed to, and I want to be able to know who's accessing things. That is all a function of figuring out risk. And as we've seen over the years, we've had a problem with internal threats becoming bigger than the external threats. And so that's why the growth of solutions like identity management has become hotter over the years. So they're all a function of risk. I would argue that disaster recovery and data protection are the same kind of argument, that you are attempting to mitigate risk. You are attempting to use those platforms to do something to get rid of a potential unknown out there that you can't quantify. Here's my acid test for this. If I had an unlimited budget, would that affect the choice of the routing protocol that I made? Unless you're talking about one of those really weird edge cases where Facebook is developing their own routing protocol that does not obey any kind of programming structures and just assumes that all packets are 512 megabytes in size, I would say that the unlimited budget that you have really doesn't impact the choice of your routing protocol. If you have an unlimited budget for security, does that change the way that you design your security? It absolutely does. Talk to any security professional, and they will tell you that the risk averse nature of what security does is absolutely predicated on the idea that you need to pick and choose what you're going to do based on how much money you're willing to spend. And the more money you're willing to spend, well, the more security you can have. And I would argue that disaster recovery and data protection are the exact same conversation. Don't believe me? I want you to go into the office of your CIO and I want you to ask them, what do you want to back up? And then I want you to ask them, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you want to back up? Because I promise you that if with an unlimited budget and the ability to buy all of the hardware and software that they need, they would keep hourly snapshots of every file in your organization. The reason why they have to use a grandfather, father, son type rotation of their media has nothing to do with the fact that they don't believe those files need to be backed up that often. It more often has to do with the fact that they're dealing with limited resources. They are trading resource availability for risk, just like a security team would. As you can see through this whole examination, the way that backup and disaster recovery operate very much align with where the security team is focused right now. So let's project this forward. One of the things that makes me think that disaster recovery and data protection is very much a function of the security team is simply the access that it needs to have to your organization to be able to do its job. Does anybody know what permissions the backup operators group and Active Directory needs to have in order to do things? The answer is it'll probably scare you. It needs to have a lot of very highly sensitive permissions. In fact, it's one of the shortcuts that you use whenever you're trying to get into a system. If you can get yourself added to the backup operators group, well, you can suddenly do a whole lot of stuff that you're really not supposed to be able to do that, ironically enough, looks an awful lot like someone trying to back things up. So, yeah. And that's something that really needs to be managed by your security team. They need to know who are members of the backup operators group. They need to run regular audits of that to make sure that things are working. That's a very simple, cut and dried solution. But let's extend this further. Let's actually have a disaster happen. Okay. We don't want disasters to happen, but theoretically. And let's say it's a cyber incident. Something locks all of your data. Okay, fine. Who's going to get the first phone call? Is it the disaster recovery and business continuity people? I would argue that it's the security folks. Then who are the security folks going to have to call? Well, they're going to have to call everybody. They're going to have to call the server team and the network team and all these other folks. They're going to have to call the disaster recovery team. What if they didn't have to call the disaster recovery team because the disaster recovery team was already part of the security team? They're already there. They're already engaged because we're now talking about mitigating risk. Look at the metrics that we use to measure backup and disaster recovery effectiveness: recovery point objective, recovery time objective, RPO and RTO. Any backup solution that you talk about will have those kinds of metrics. It's a risk thing. Your recovery time objective is very much gated by how much risk you're willing to assume. If you are a platform that has very little day-to-day change in your data, if the amount of updates that you do is in the dozens, your recovery time objective can be much longer than a lot of other, more critical data. If you are a transaction processing system, if you are transacting with online purchases and things like that, you need a much quicker recovery time objective. You are willing to pay more money to reduce the risk. And that effectively boils down how we look at backup and disaster recovery and data protection. Your budget for what you want to do with these things is very much looking at the RPO and the RTO and how much risk you're willing to assume that that you will or won't be able to get that data back. And I think that type of analysis is best done by the team that lives in that world on a daily basis. No one will buy a backup solution solely based on how quickly it can pull files off of your servers. No one uses storage as the primary metric for how much to spend on a disaster recovery data protection solution. But I promise you that if you use the RPO and the RTO as your major function, that you're a lot closer to being a security actor than you are anyone else. Because in the event of something like a ransomware attack or a natural disaster, the only thing that matters is reducing the risk to your employees and your customers by getting your systems back online as soon as possible. So why not put the best team in charge of that? Yes, it's a break with tradition. Yes, there are a lot of people on those teams that don't want to work with the security folks. But if you realign the way that your organizations work, I think you'll find they'll work a lot more smoothly and the folks get along a lot better than they have. And quite honestly, you're already going to see that messaging coming from companies like Commvault and Rubrik because that's what they see the future as. They understand that data protection is security. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of Tomversations. I had an interesting time talking about one of my favorite topics, security. Don't forget that each episode of Tomversations, we tackle a different kind of area. It could be wireless and mobility. It could be networking. It could even be something fun like an emerging technology. And they come out every month here on our channel. You can check out our website at gestaltit.com or you subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/gestaltitvideo. Make sure that you are notified whenever we publish a new video. And if you have any comments, please make sure you leave them below. If you have thoughts on what you think disaster recovery should be, is it security? Is it traditional infrastructure? Is it something entirely different? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Please join us next month for another great episode. I look forward to being able to talk to you then.